I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Smith. I am the finance steward with the Ready. Today, I'm going to start by just giving you a brief introduction to who the Ready is, if you aren't already familiar with our work, and how we operate and how we're structured. And then I'm going to be moving into a budgeting experiment that we are currently carrying out in our system, giving you a little bit of context into why we started this experiment, how it's going, and what's next. So, who is the Ready? The Ready is a fully self-managed future of work consultancy. We're committed to changing how the world works, from business as usual to brave new work. We've partnered with hundreds of clients across the globe and helped them work in more people positive and complexity conscious ways. Our signature work is called the OS transformation work. We partner with companies specifically to evolve what we have termed their operating systems, or OS. The operating system is a collection of implicit and explicit constraints that shape how companies operate within their organizations. That can be anything from how meetings work, what the operating rhythms are, who holds authority, and again, all of the areas of the OS canvas are listed here. The canvas can be used to either articulate the specific ways of working, to diagnose positive or negative patterns, or it can be used aspirationally as to imagining different ways to evolve. So when faced with a complexity in the OS canvas, the best way to pursue any change is with an adaptive, experiential, and learning-oriented approach. We use the OS canvas to discuss stories, tensions, and experiments that are happening inside the organizations. And we also function as a laboratory ourselves, constantly experimenting internally with our own felt tensions in the system through a process called the change loop. We are sensing tensions, asking the question of what's stopping us from doing our best work. We're considering practices. What are all of the things that we could try to get to the adjacent possible? And we're conducting experiments. What are we going to try to move things forward and learn by doing? We have never had a traditional top-down structure, and instead we're structured in circles, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. We've also never had a traditional budgeting process either. So finances were and have been viewed in terms of general tolerances, and budgeting was done through dynamically distributing decision right authority throughout the organization. For example, once a year as a new circle steward is elected into their role, they would create a new role charter and circle charter that would, sorry if you're seeing all this stuff popping up, that would give them decision right to spend up to $30,000 a month on any of the activities that they see as necessary to pursue the goal of their circle. Another example is at any given time, a member could propose a 3-month-long initiative or mission-based team with a price tag of $50,000. So most of these proposals, as they came in, were approved. It made it really easy to get access to resources and allowed mission-based teams and circles to move quickly. Now, this method, of course, worked really well during times of prosperity, but as you can imagine, it can be hard to kind of keep the rails on when things are just constantly coming in, and you're kind of basing it on like, sure, this feels like the right thing to do right now. But as these investments on the edge continued and were increasing, they were not only causing expenses at the edge, they were contributing to center costs as well, kind of those hidden costs of doing more. So profit margins started to decline, and our financials were showing us that we were out of tolerance. And this phrase, out of tolerance, became a trigger in our system, and everyone kind of panicked and they were alarmed. What should we do? What should we do? So in comes the quick shifts in governance. We were reducing pay. We were targeting individuals for not contributing to financial health. We were adding more constraints to profit margins on projects. And all of these constraints being added and added and added were leading to feelings of scarcity, uncertainty. What should we do? Why isn't this working? And even after all these constraints were added, we still weren't getting back into levels of tolerance. And I think this just kind of shows our natural tendency is to, when things are starting to feel out of control, we add more controls. But really what should happen is you pause, take a step back, really kind of see like what is actually happening in the system. Notice the inputs, like what is causing us to be out of tolerance, analyze that data, and then incrementally respond. So I joined the company earlier this year, right in the middle of the seesaw between chaos and bureaucracy. And before I decided to add any more constraints as the finance steward, I spent months cleaning up our financial data. So that means really separating out like what are the fixed costs that will happen regardless of what happens on the edge, and what are those variable costs that we are making decisions to spend. Adding classes to transactions to show the relationship between expenses and revenue. So a lot of companies do that for their projects, but I was treating all of our internal work the same as projects. So I could see the profit margin for all of our internal work as well. And in doing so, I was really able to step back and notice what was happening, which led to my first experiment as a member at the Ready. I was going to try to identify the third way of getting back into tolerance, one that was more organized than chaos and more adaptive than bureaucracy. And I also just wanted to point out, it's interesting. I'm not sure if you found the connection yet, but this is the work that the Ready does with clients. We help them identify the third way that isn't tiered to bureaucracy and also isn't chaotic. But it's interesting that when it comes to money, sometimes it's harder to take that approach that you would take with clients with yourself. So I do think it helped to have someone new coming into the system that kind of like held up a mirror and said, hey, this is the work that we do with clients. Let's do it on ourselves as well. So the tension that I had identified in the system was around how we allocated our resources. And to put it in a nutshell, I said there was too much decentralized spend happening. There was a sprawling collection of energetic yet uncoordinated investments happening. Everyone was really dedicated to the work that they were doing individually, but it wasn't all tied back to one single strategy. The allocations were not happening in alignment with revenue. So spend remained at the same level, regardless of how revenue was coming in. So spending more than we made. Also, because of the frequency and the rhythm of when money was being requested or proposed to the system, there was no way to really prioritize what we funded because we just kind of said yes to things as they came in. There was no process in place to collectively decide to stop funding something. So you say yes once, and it just kind of happened until they decided to fund something new. So we needed something in place to say, hey, should we continue spending money on this thing? And kind of in the same vein, there was no retrospective happening on, did we learn anything? Was that the best use of funding? Should we do something different? So kind of the first step in this experiment was regrounding ourselves in our essential intent. I think now that we had the story of how we were spending money, what we were spending money on, it told us where we were. And we just needed to remind ourselves, like, what are we actually trying to do as the Ready? Again, this practice is standard when we're working with clients, but so often we forget to do that ourselves. And we almost think our essential intent is to remain profitable, but that is not the essential intent. What we're actually trying to do is go back to our purpose, go back to our vision, because those things should lead us to being profitable. The profit is not the input, that's the outcome. So now we're going to get into the tactics. What I had proposed is a new rhythm and a new method for allocating resources. Moving a little more centralized from the complete decentralized allocations that were happening before, really kind of coming into the middle and using our forecast to kind of tell us what was available and decide how often do we want to be doing this. So also what's important is to figure out what resources are you actually talking about. In our case, we were not talking about all of the money because again, there are some fixed costs that have already been governed. There are cost of goods sold for all of our projects. So you can see from the example here, we were forecasting revenue, forecasting our COGS, forecasting the OPEX, and that remaining amount is the resources that we were talking about in this experiment. Also, I think rhythm is important because again, in that traditional budgeting model, you would be looking at 12 months before you, but we chose 3 months or 90 days because that is our typical contracting and sales cycle. We're also already in the habit of doing 90-day outcomes, and with finance, reporting in quarters is already quite simple. So again, and I guess I should back up. This does depend on having a reliable reporting and forecasting tool in place. So that is some of the work that needs to be done. If you're not that far yet, you could use something like cash on hand. What percentage of cash on hand do you want to be looking at for your resource allocations? Or you can be looking at historical operating profit from months before. But if you look at our example here, taking forecasted revenue over the next 3 months, subtracting those things that we already know must be spent, our remaining amount, which is like our surplus, is about $595,000. So those are the resources that we were going to discuss how to best allocate. And I'm calling this section what we did wrong the first time. All of the circles presented their budget. This is actual snapshots of the work that we did. We asked all the circles to contribute. What do you need to do, or what money do you need for the next 3 months in order to do the work at the ready? We took all of the proposals, rolled it up, and it was roughly about $300,000 more than what we had to spend. And there were so many initiatives that were being proposed. We said, there's no way we can do it, which was kind of validating at the time because it's like, yes, this was the problem that I had identified. We're spending too much on too many things. So I do think, even though this was like our first shot and it's not how we're going to do it again, this process had never actually been done before of seeing what is the actual spend, what's under the hood, what have we been investing in, where is the org debt that we no longer need to be spending money on. And another reason we won't do this again is because feedback that we received was, man, this really is starting to feel like a line by line permission-based budgeting process. People were proposing, people were defending their proposals. It wasn't really clear like who would say, like who had the authority to say yes or no. So it was kind of like putting circles against each other, which was not what we wanted to do, not people positive or complexity conscious at all. And I do think, let me back up. It did help because it has started to right size. For the next quarter, we are looking to actually start to turn a profit. So it has kind of helped us. I'm framing this as like the turnaround resource allocation. If money is tight and you are noticing declines, sometimes it is good to do this diagnostic line by line. Where is the spend and where can we cut? But this is not what we will do the next time. What we are trying next time around is using what's called the Innovation Ambition Matrix. This is inspired by the Harvard Business Review article. I'm not going to go into too much of the detail on the theory behind the matrix, but I do recommend that if you're interested, please check it out. What it's actually trying to do instead is to look at the high level, going back to that essential intent, your purpose and your vision. What is it that you're trying to do? Where are you trying to go? And from there, you really look down to these three different areas of core, adjacent, and transformational. The core is the investment in your existing products, your existing customers, your existing work. The adjacent is kind of like the next level of risk of expanding into new business, new territories. And then the transformational is kind of like the full-on swing into a new line of business. And as well, we are called the source circle, which is like our leadership team. It's all of the elected circle stewards that come together. You kind of decide as a group, what should that mix be? The traditional or like typical mix is about 70% should be invested in your core, 20% goes to that adjacent space, and 10% is going into transformational. Again, it'll vary based on your business, based on where you are, based on what your essential intent is, but this is just kind of the standard. So from there, again, this is just a completely different way of viewing the same work, but viewing it in buckets of where you're really trying to invest, more in the core, adjacent, and transformational. And what it's essentially doing is asking you, what is the work that must be done, and who is going to do the work? So that's where we create our mission-based teams. And it's no longer just based on circles, because again, I think that's where you start to get into the circle versus circle competing for resources. This is really looking for the cross collaboration of this team must get together to work towards this portion of our strategy. And from there, the work is identified, the teams are identified, and each team kind of comes up with what resources are needed to meet the outcomes of those teams. And again, you're always kind of chasing back to, are we still sticking in that portfolio? Because sometimes I think it's really easy to be really safe and you're doing everything in core, or maybe you're the opposite and you want to do all the stuff in transformational. And really that transformational has the longer term outcomes. So if you're looking for like a turnaround, you should probably be focused more on the short term core work. Let's see. So what and now what? I think, again, going back to the original tension of like, it's a natural inclination to now start to do budget to actual reportings. Each mission-based team is checking in and saying like, what's the progress on your spend? But instead, something that I'm consciously experimenting with is letting this be the work and now handing off the work to the teams. That's where we get back into the autonomy that the system loved in the beginning and the authority that's really living at the edges. Now, each team has the money, they have the essential intent, they have the strategy to execute on that work. I think for me in my role, it doesn't mean that I'm just not doing anything. I'm still paying attention to the forecast, making sure that those things that we had estimated are coming to fruition, keeping an eye on revenue, keeping an eye on the operating expenses. Also gauging attitudes, like how is the system responding to this? Do people feel like they have enough money to do the work that they need to do? Do they like the process? And then are there any roadblocks coming up? Really just checking in, like, is there any surprises? Does anything need to change? And I think, again, this is where the dance between centralization and decentralization lies, that it's not really a binary, and it can be kind of that like dynamic that flows in between. You come to the center to make the decisions, and then the decisions disperse on the edge. And that's all I've got today. If you want to learn more about the Ready, please visit theready.com. Or if anyone has any questions or wants to chat, please email me, Ashley@theready.com.